So today I'm going to discuss one important topic. Just 1 second, let the just 1 second. So today we are going to discuss one important topic on one of the important practical point topic, which is usually some most of the time a short case and sometimes a long case for most of the uh, MD and DNB medicine exams, which is a valvular heart disease. Some of the most of the time you will get a mixed valvular heart disease where you mixed means in a single valve when like you get a MSMR or in a single valve ASAR or a MS with a uh, MS with a, even a pulmonary artery hypertension, hypertensive pulmonary artery hypertension. That is a mixed valvular heart disease. Whereas a multivalvular is when it involves a two or more valve like a aortic and mitral valve involvement together, let it be MSMR or MSAR or MRAR or MRAS. So that is known as a multivalvular. So today we are going to discuss the important aspects of a valvular heart disease right from the history and important examination findings. So I'll go a little slow. Whenever you have a doubt, you can just interrupt me and ask any question. Now, history taking and physical examination are the most important clinical skills. So before you should give equal and in time to the history taking in all the valvular heart disease because you have only five symptoms named angina, dyspnea, fatigue, palpitation, and syncope. And on based on these five symptoms, you have to make the diagnosis of a which valve it is more likely. Like I'll come to it, but we know that a dyspnea on exertion is more likely to be a stenotic lesion like the MS and the AS, whereas the fatigue and palpitation goes more for a regurgitant lesions like a AR and MR. So that history is very important. Like angina and syncope goes for directly left ventricular outflow tract obstruction like AS. So these are the few things which you should have a important understanding when you are taking the history taking, because only based on sometimes the clinical chief complaints the examiner may ask you what valve you are dealing with and what is the important problem. And then the equal importance would be given to the physical examination, which is divided into a general examination, cardiovascular examination, and sometimes you may have to take the example of respiratory system like basal crepitations for pulmonary edema and hepatomegaly, pedal edema, and other finding like ascites and splenomegaly for right side heart failure. So those are other important findings which are important. But despite the numerous technologies, the skill remain crucial for accurate diagnosis. So at the end, we know that we have to do the echocardiographic and we will get the diagnosis. But still, the telling the diagnosis at the end of the history and examination remains fascinating both for you and for the examiner and will help you in long term. So history and physical examination will establish a diagnosis in almost 80 to 90% of the time. Now, foundation for a successful doctor-patient relationship is very important, and that is the key of history taking and physical examination. So, in a valvular heart disease, it is the most commonly encountered in your clinical practice. In your, if you see a bedside patient in your medicine ward, it will be mostly after a heart failure patient. It will be a valvular heart disease. Not unlikely in a cardiology ward where you see most of the time ischemic heart disease followed by heart failure and a valvular heart disease. Also, the most common cause is rheumatic heart disease. Whenever a valvular heart disease is there, out of the 10 times, if 8 times you tell it is a rheumatic heart disease, you will be correct. It is just like a ventricular tachycardia. Out of any wide QRS tachycardia, if you tell ventricular tachycardia 8 times, you will be correct out of the 10 times. So it is the same as in the rheumatic heart disease. But there are a number of other causes which I'll discuss each based on the valve. Now let's discuss the important causes of valvular heart disease. As I told you, 8 out of the 10 times if you tell a rheumatic heart disease, you will be right. Now I'll come to it. What is the important findings of a rheumatic heart disease? It is the 4 C's which we'll discuss in a mitral stenosis. Second most important is the congenital heart disease. We know the most common congenital heart disease is actually a bicuspid aortic valve, which involves 2 to 4 out of 100 patients. But still, we tell that the most common congenital heart disease is a mitral valve prolapse. But still, the most common congenital heart disease is actually a bicuspid aortic valve. So MVP can be there, and bicuspid aortic valve, which can cause AS and AR, can be there. Inherited diseases, Marfan syndrome. It is very important in general examination, as we discussed in previous classes. You should know all the examination findings related to the Marfans, like the upper segment, lower segment, arm span, to the total height ratio, thumb sign, wrist sign, high arch palate, you should know. Arcanodactyly is there, scoliosis, kyphosis is there, supromedial subluxation of lens is there, and many more. So everything is there, but at the end, the examiner will ask you what all cardiac finding disease can be there in Marfan. So you should know it involves most commonly the aortic regurgitation due to the aortic dissection or the dilatation of the aorta. Also, it can cause MR via MVP and a tricuspid valve prolapse and TR. So these are the important thing in Marfan's. Then we have the degenerative diseases like the degenerative aortic stenosis. We know out of the 3 important causes of AS, the top and the most important is degenerative and not the rheumatic. Because if you have an isolated aortic stenosis or an isolated aortic valve involvement, you are more likely dealing with a degenerative than a rheumatic. So isolated AS is a rare and it never happens in a rheumatic heart disease. So degenerative is the most common, and the second most common cause for AS is a bicuspid aortic valve, followed by a rheumatic heart disease. So these 3 important causes of AS you should know. And then we have a degenerative MR, which is very, though not very common in old people and all, due to mitral annular calcification, you can get MR. Next cause is the endocarditis. We know people, it is difficult to get in a people who have a normal valve, but people who have a MVP bicuspid valve, they are more likely to develop endocarditis. And this don't present with chronic MR and all. They present with acute MR and acute AR. So the presentation is acute. Later we'll discuss what are the causes of acute AR MR in the further slides. Next cause is inflammatory, like a autoarteritis or a Takayasu disease. So that can also cause a valvular involvement. Next is myocardial dysfunction. We know LV dysfunction can cause annular dilatation, which cause MR, and then it becomes a MR begets MR. Further MR, it causes annular dilatation. It further increases the MR. That is why we call it MR begets MR. Then we have carcinoid syndrome. You will know that the carcinoid is something where 5-hydroxyindole acetic acid is released, and then it causes a TIPS, TIPS, that is tricuspid insufficiency followed by pulmonary stenosis. So these two are very common: tricuspid insufficiency TR and pulmonary stenosis in carcinoid. And finally, we have drugs like the methotrexate and all, and the radiation therapy, which can involve the valve. So these are the various list of and causes of a valvular heart disease. Now let's discuss one by one. So the most common valve lesion which you will get in daily practice, day-to-day life, is a mitral stenosis, and that is the most common. And as I told you, 98 to 99% of the time it's the rheumatic, and the rheumatic is the most common. But still, the examiner will ask you at the end of the diagnosis what are the other causes of mitral stenosis. So you should at least tell 5 other causes, like congenital mitral stenosis, also known as the juvenile mitral stenosis, which I'll discuss. Then we have a degenerative mitral stenosis, which is very rare. You should tell it in the end. But before that, you should tell that something like SLE and rheumatoid arthritis, again, we don't see much. Mucopolysaccharidosis like Hunter and Hurler syndrome. Radiation can cause, carcinoid can cause, and drug induced like methotrexate. So apart from rheumatic heart disease, you should know at least 5 other causes of mitral stenosis in your examination and during exam times. Now, as I discussed, what are the 4 C's in mitral stenosis? The most common is actually individual is the commissural involvement. We know any valve, like a mitral valve, has few parts: a leaflet, then we have a commissures where the leaflets join, then we have a cusp of the leaflet, we have a chordae in the LV, and then we can have other causes. But the most common is the commissural fusion. There is a commissural fusion that causes mitral stenosis. Next is the cuspal. It is because of the leaflet thickening. That is why it is called cuspal. Then we have a caudal involvement, subvalvular. It is a subvalvular, that is chordae is involved. But most of the time it is a mixed involvement of commissure, cuspal, and caudal. And that is why combined, fourth C is combined, which is the most common overall. However, on if you ask the history of a rheumatic fever, like the history of throat pain, history of arthritis, migratory polyarthritis, Sydenham's chorea or erythema marginatum, or if you ask the history of subcutaneous nodule, you'll get that history only in 50% of the cases. So only half of the patient will give history of rheumatic fever or rheumatic prophylaxis. Other half won't remember the history or won't have that history. In females, up to 80% of the time, you may get the history of a rheumatic fever. Now, let's discuss the symptoms of mitral stenosis. Now, we know the most common symptom of mitral stenosis is progressive exertional dyspnea. So, the most common symptom is dyspnea, and you should remember, you should not tell fatigue, angina, syncope. The most common symptom is dyspnea. And why does that dyspnea happen? We'll discuss in the further slides. It is not necessary that all patients who have dyspnea will have orthopnea and PND in MS. Few patients will give you history of orthopnea PND, others may not give you history. I have already discussed the mechanism of orthopnea and PND in the previous classes, but you can just remember orthopnea is the dyspnea in lying down position which is relieved on sitting position, whereas PND you get after 2 to 3 hours after going to sleep. Orthopnea is due to the increased fluid in the LA, which goes to the pulmonary and causes pulmonary capillary wedge pressure to increase alveolar congestion, which stimulates the J receptors and causes increased work of breathing. Whereas the main mechanism of PND is the shift of fluid from the interstitial to the intravascular compartment, which takes about 2 to 3 hours. And that is why PND takes 2 to 3 hours to happen. So these are the principal mechanism of orthopnea in PND. However, orthopnea can also happen because of the pulling up of the diaphragm. That is why in bilateral diaphragmatic palsy, you get orthopnea. Other causes of orthopnea are ascites and pleural effusion. PND is very sensitive for left heart failure. You do not get any other place PND. But there are certain other mechanisms of PND like decreased sympathetic drive, decreased REM sleep, increased REM sleep, decreased respiratory drive, or nocturnal arrhythmias. So these are the other mechanisms of PND. People may ask you in exam, what are the mimickers of PND? So you can answer like asthma. Early morning asthma can sometimes mimic PND. Post nasal drip can mimic. GERD can mimic. Obstructive sleep apnea. So these are the mimickers of PND. Other important symptom is MS is acute pulmonary edema. Patient may go to acute pulmonary edema due to high LA pressure or tachycardia. Then other symptoms are nocturnal cough and wheezing, and people may confuse it with the bronchial asthma. Hemoptysis is one important symptom. I'll come to it that there are 5 to 6 causes of hemoptysis in mitral stenosis, and they will definitely ask you in exam if the patient has hemoptysis. Next thing is winter's bronchitis. Winter's bronchitis is during the winter season, they get frequent cough and sputum production like LRTI, which is due to the secretion of the mucus glands. So these are the symptoms of mitral stenosis. Other important symptoms are there like the Ortner syndrome, which is due to dilated LA or the dilated pulmonary artery or the enlarged tracheobronchial lymph nodes can compress the recurrent laryngeal nerve and cause the Ortner syndrome, or even they can cause the dysphagia sometimes. Patient can also have atrial fibrillation, which can cause thromboembolism, and then you will have the manifestations of thromboembolic symptom. And finally, the patient will land up into PAH and right side heart failure, where you can get ascites, pedal edema, decreased urine output, jaundice, facial congestion. So this is the terminal stage of MS where severe PAH and RV dysfunction sets in. Now, as I already discussed, the dyspnea is the chief symptom of mitral stenosis, and it is precipitated by few things. So people may ask you, the patient is very stable in a mitral stenosis. Now suddenly he presents with you to NYHA class 4. Why? A NYHA class 1 to 2 patient, why suddenly decompensated and precipitated in failure? There are books which mention the 10 causes. Out of this, if you remember top 5 also, it is important, but the first two causes is always important because the first important precipitant of a decompensation in a patient with compensated heart failure is sepsis. Sepsis causes tachycardia. Shortens the diastole, increases the systole. So because the diastole is shortened, your LA pressure is increased, and so the patient goes to dyspnea and pulmonary edema. And most of the of this causes, this is the mechanism. Like second most important thing is atrial fibrillation. Whenever a patient in MS gets AF, there is an increased rate which decreases the diastole duration and increase the LA pressure. When the LA pressure is increased, the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is increased, which causes breathlessness. Other important precipitants are the withdrawal of drugs, then anemia, pregnancy, hyperthyroidism. These are the other precipitating factors. We know in pregnancy, overall cardiac output is increased and heart rate is increased. And that is why their LA pressure is increased and cardiac output is increased. So that is why in pregnancy, the patient with MS may get worsened. Other important precipitants are if the patient gets a acute rheumatic fever. If the patient already has a established rheumatic heart disease but gets an episode of acute rheumatic fever which may worsen the carditis, that can cause the worsening. Acute ischemic heart disease or acute MI may worsen, and rarely patient who takes the bouts of alcohol and all may worsen. So these are the causes of worsening of a stable mitral stenosis. Now, what are the mechanisms of dyspnea? I'll again mention the first important is the elevation of mean LA pressure. So, what does happen because the valve is very tight, the LA is dilated, the mean LA pressure is increased, and that causes the pulmonary venous hypertension, which causes pulmonary congestion and the interstitial edema, activating the J receptors, which causes the increased work of breathing. That is the most important mechanism you should know. Other important mechanisms are that there is a decrease in lung compliance. Why? Because so much fluid is there in the lung, it increases the work of breathing, and that is why the lung compliance is reduced. You should just know that J receptor, the term was coined by Dr. A.S. Penthal, who is an Indian scientist, and he used the term juxtapulmonary capillary receptors, also known as the J receptors in the alveolar walls. We know that the mechanisms of dyspnea is because of the three reasons: mechanoreceptors, which are the J receptors, metaboreceptors, and the chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are present in the carotid bodies, and metaboreceptors are present in the skeletal muscles. The chemoreceptors are activated by hypoxia, hypercarbia, and acidosis, whereas the metaboreceptors are sometimes activated by acidosis and other things. So these are the things you should remember about the mechanisms of dyspnea. Other important mechanism of dyspnea is the increased airway resistance due to edema of bronchial valves. We know in mitral stenosis, because the valve is very tight, the LA to LV blood doesn't go much, and so there is a decreased cardiac output, which causes the fatigue of respiratory muscles, which causes dyspnea. Also, there is a respiratory muscle myopathy known as the muscle hypothesis, and finally, the ventilation perfusion mismatch. In mitral stenosis, once the pH sets in, your dyspnea disappears. You should always remember that. People will ask you, what are the causes of the dyspnea coming down in patient with mitral stenosis? One important is the development of pulmonary artery hypertension. In that case, the dyspnea will come down because, and the orthopnea PND will come down. Another important cause of decreased dyspnea in mitral stenosis is the development of tricuspid valve disease like tricuspid stenosis. Now, what is the difference between the dyspnea in a mitral stenosis and in the dyspnea in a aortic valve disease? We know in aortic valve disease like the aortic stenosis, the dyspnea is a very late finding once the patient develops LV dysfunction, let it be systolic dysfunction or a diastolic dysfunction. Till that time, patient is very well compensated and do not tell of dyspnea. In MS, the dyspnea is very early. Once the patient develops rheumatic fever, the symptom onset is very fast, and it is not terminal. Patient with dyspnea also can survive for long. Whereas in a patient with aortic valve disease, once the dyspnea happens, your survival is almost around only 2 years. There is a mnemonic that 532, that ASD in aortic stenosis. A is angina For angina, it's 5-year survival. For syncope, it is 3-year survival. And for dyspnea, it's 2-year survival. So you can remember like that. So once the AS sets in, dyspnea sets in aortic valve disease, it's almost a terminal thing. In mitral stenosis, it's an early symptom. And why does dyspnea happen in aortic valve disease? It is due to rise in left ventricular end diastolic pressure, which causes dyspnea. Uh, it is more ominous in aortic valve disease compared to mitral, and on and off worsening and improving. Patient may get dyspnea and may improve. But once the patient with aortic valve disease develop dyspnea, it's always a downhill course. There is no coming back unless you intervene. And MS, it has a long survival. But in aortic valve disease, I told you, once the patient has dyspnea, the survival is only 2 years or less. So this is something which you should know about the dyspnea in the two disease. Now let's discuss hemoptysis. Now hemoptysis, everybody will ask you once you get a case of mitral stenosis that what are the causes of hemoptysis. The most common cause of hemoptysis in mitral stenosis is pulmonary apoplexy. And what is apoplexy? The rupture of thin walled dilated bronchial veins. Because of the high LA pressure, there is so much pressure in the bronchial vein that there is a rupture which causes a hemoptysis. Second mechanism is the PND. Episodes of PND may cause a blood stained sputum. Acute pulmonary edema also may cause the rupture of the alveolar capillaries and cause hemoptysis. Then patients with MS, because of the thromboembolism, can have pulmonary infarction. Most commonly, it is seen in patients with pulmonary artery hypertension in MS. And finally, winter's bronchitis. Winter's bronchitis, I told you, is due to chronic bronchial hyperemia and hypersecretion of the serous gland. Because there is an excessive mucus production in winter season, 28% of patients with mitral stenosis can have winter bronchitis. Two other mechanisms are there. Patient on warfarin can have hemoptysis, and the terminal stage of mitral stenosis known as hemosiderosis that can cause hemoptysis. Now, what are the other less common symptoms in mitral stenosis? If the patient of mitral stenosis has chest pain, which is seen in 15% of the case, you should always think common things like a pulmonary artery hypertension, which may cause chest pain. Rarely the chest pain can be due to the coronary emboli, or the chest pain can be due to the associated aortic. So always think that the patient may have associated aortic valve involvement, because as such chest pain is not common in a mitral stenosis. So patient may have aortic stenosis. You should first think that. Rare things like coronary emboli you should think in the end, but things like pulmonary artery hypertension you can think if the patient has chest pain, because the dilated pulmonary artery can compress the left main, that can cause chest pain. But rarely, more commonly, RVH, right ventricular hypertrophy, due to supply demand mismatch, can cause chest pain. Patients with mitral stenosis, if they have palpitation, you should first think of atrial fibrillation, that the patient will be having paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. But in the terminal stage, the patient may develop permanent atrial fibrillation. So always first think of AF before thinking that there is associated mitral regurgitation, which may cause palpitation in mitral stenosis. Systemic embolism is seen only in 1/5. So only 20% of the patient with mitral stenosis may have systemic embolism, and most of the time it goes to cerebral, less common as a peripheral vascular disease. As I already discussed, the causes of Ortner syndrome, which is the hoarseness of voice, it can be due to dilated lymph nodes or dilated LA or dilated pulmonary artery. Finally, in the end stage, patient will have a right-sided heart failure. As I told you, chest pain in mitral stenosis is seen in 15%. It is most commonly due to RV ischemia. Also due to atherosclerotic coronary artery disease, which is not very common in mitral stenosis compared to aortic stenosis. 50% of the patient with aortic stenosis can have coronary artery disease, which is less common in mitral stenosis. Also, coronary emboli is seen only in 1%, so you should tell this in the end as the cause of chest pain. Other symptoms like syncope is very rare. If the patient with mitral stenosis has syncope, you should always think that the patient has severe PAH, which can cause syncope because of the low RV cardiac output. Rarely, mitral stenosis can be associated with a ball valve thrombus, like an atrial myxoma, which can have syncope. But those are rare things. More common is the severe PAH, or sometimes you can also tell that the patient may have aortic valve involvement, like the aortic stenosis, and that is why he is getting syncope. fatigue happens very late. The causes of fatigue in mitral stenosis is due to severe pulmonary artery hypertension causing RV failure and TR. So that is the thing you should remember. Fatigue is due to the RV involvement, due to the TR, PAH, and RV dysfunction. So that is very late finding. So overall, what history favors mitral stenosis? Long history of dyspnea. Patient is telling that I am having history of for last dyspnea for last 10 years, which is coming and going, and finally one day patient presents to you with NYHA class 4, which has worsened over last few months, and that has worsened. Then orthopnea PND goes in the favor of MS, hemoptysis goes in the favor of MS, and systemic embolism goes in the favor of MS. So these things you should always remember. Now, what are the complications of mitral stenosis? People will ask you again in the exam. So you should tell them it may be related to the severity and unrelated to the severity. So which complications of mitral stenosis are related to severity? The first thing you should always tell is PAH, because you know in the examination also they will tell you if the patient has PAH means it is a severe mitral stenosis. So PAH is definitely related to severity. But the other things like atrial fibrillation, which is related to the patient's age and the left atrium size, is not related to severity. Systemic embolism is not related to severity. And endocarditis, which is very rare. We know the more common causes of endocarditis is mitral valve prolapse and bicuspid aortic valve and a ventricular septal defect. Atrial septal defect and mitral stenosis are very rare to cause infective endocarditis because the gradient between LA and LV is very less, and the gradient between RA and LA is very less in ASD. That is why they are very less likely to develop endocarditis. Endocarditis is seen only in less than 1% of the patient. Systemic embolism is seen in 20% of the patient. AF I will discuss in the next slide. But if it is related to severity, it is the pulmonary artery hypertension. It is usually suprasystemic in mitral stenosis. So how many patients with mitral stenosis develop AF? Overall, the incidence, if you see, it is 40%. So 4 out of 10 may develop atrial fibrillation. And the strongest predictor is age. So very rare, less than 20 years, but more than 50 years, 80% will have AF. So if you see 100 mitral stenosis more than 50 years, 80 of them will have atrial fibrillation. And if you see the LA size, if the LA is less than 40 mm, it is rare to get atrial fibrillation. If it is more than 55 mm, it is more common to have a atrial fibrillation. So it is also dependent on the LA size. As I already discussed, initially it is paroxysmal and later it becomes a persistent atrial fibrillation, which causes the palpitation most commonly at rest and sometimes on exertion. One important thing in AF in mitral stenosis you should know, you should check the pulse 3 times and the BP 3 times and see the mean recording. AF causes a lot of discrete other finding changes in MS, like you have to see the peripheral pulses because the patient may AF may have embolism. Varying intensity of the first heart sound will be there in MS. JVP A wave will be absent and X descent will be absent. So these are the things which AF causes. Also in AF, you may not be able to get a pre-systolic accentuation. The opening step may still be there. And your A2OS in a longer cycle, tachycardia cycles in AF will have a narrow A2OS, which I'll discuss in further slides. So these are the findings which the AF will change in patients with mitral stenosis. They will again ask you in exam, how does a AF affect the MS? Now, what is the mechanism of pulmonary artery hypertension in MS? I won't go into very deep because it's not related now to you now in way. You should know something about it, but not much in detail. There are 3 types of PA: reactive, passive, and obliterative. The most common is passive due to the pulmonary venous because of the raised LA pressure. There is a pulmonary venous hypertension which causes a passive pulmonary hypertension. Second is the reactive. Reactive is because the LA is very large. Because of the large LA, it activates the baroreceptor and it causes the pulmonary vasoconstriction. This is reversible. Why? Once you do a balloon mitral valvotomy, most of the reactive pulmonary artery hypertension or also after a surgery, it comes down. That is why we say it is reversible. However, the third type of PH, which is the obliterative pulmonary artery hypertension, which is seen in a long-standing MS, even if you do a pulmonary balloon mitral valvotomy or a surgery, this type of PH may not come down. So these are irreversible. That is the obliterative pH. Now juvenile MS. This you should just know a few important salient things about juvenile MSs. It is seen in the kids below 20 years. So if you get a kid of 20, 21 years age who is having severe mitral stenosis, you should tell that it is a juvenile or a congenital mitral stenosis. The photo you see is of a Dr. Roy. You know, he was a famous physician and a cardiologist, and he gave the term juvenile mitral stenosis. Dr. Sujay B. Roy. And the difference in adult mitral rheumatic, these are also rheumatic, but the difference from the adult is one, in adult there is a more predilection for females as compared to male. In juvenile mitral stenosis there is no difference predilection, both common in both male and female. You get a significant pH in patients with juvenile mitral stenosis. Why? Because the valve is very tight. You get something known as the pinpoint valve. The valve area is very less. You get significant pulmonary artery hypertension, and you have a severe subvalvular submitral disease as compared to the adult. But what is less common is mitral valve calcification is less common, AF is less common, and thromboembolism is rare. These three things are rare in juvenile MS: mitral valve calcification, atrial fibrillation, and thromboembolism. And now let's go to the clinical part. How do you assess the severity of mitral stenosis? Again, a sure short question if you get a mitral stenosis case in your exam. So there are three things which tells the severity. One is long diastolic murmur. If your diastolic murmur is long, you can definitely tell it's a severe mitral stenosis. Second is A to OS gap. The shorter the A to OS, the more severe the mitral stenosis. Like if your mitral stenosis is severe, your LA pressure is very too much, your opening snap will happen early. Why? Because of the huge LA, the opening snap is occurs because before the opening of the valve, there is a sudden tensing of the leaflet, bellowing of the leaflet, and that is why you get an opening snap. So higher the LA pressure, earlier is the opening stenosis. So a shorter A to OS gap is indicative of a severe mitral stenosis. Second is the long diastolic murmur. Third is the pulmonary artery hypertension. Never tell that if the patient is AF, it is related to the severity. Never tell that the intensity of the murmur is related to severity in mitral stenosis. So what three things I have told you, you should always remember. And always remember pre-systolic accentuation. So the murmur of mitral stenosis will increase during the pre-systolic phase. What does a loud S1? Loud S1 is due to a, we'll discuss, a loud S1 is due to many factors we'll discuss in the next few slides. And opening snap, a loud S1 and opening snap tells that the leaflet is pliable, it is not calcified, it is not destroyed, but it never tells that you have a severe mitral stenosis. It just tells that it is a pliable leaflet, not a calcified leaflet. So what are, this is the next sure short question in your examination. Why do you get a loud S1 in mitral stenosis? They will definitely ask you, why do you get a tapping apex? A tapping apex means a loud is due to a loud S1. But why do you get a loud S1 in mitral stenosis? So you have to answer like that in a patient with mitral stenosis, the LA pressure is very high. So when the LA pressure is very high, the valves are open for a longer time in diastole, and they are closed not in the diastole but during the early systole. Because of the high LA pressure, the valves are open for a longer time in diastole, and they do not close in the isovolumetric relaxation phase. They will close in the early systole, and when they close from a farther distance. And you know, when the two doors are very far, it when it closes, they will give you a loud sound. So when they are closing from a louder distance, it causes a loud S1. This is the most common mechanism of loud S1, and that is what you have to answer. Because of the high LA pressure, the valves are open for a longer time in diastole, and it closes from a longer distance, and that is why you get a loud S1. Other mechanisms are like a leaflet and the chordae are thickened and are less compliant. So the entire mitral valve apparatus may resonate. But that is, if even if you do not know, it is okay. But the most important mechanism you should know. And what determines the, if somebody asks you about S1, we have already discussed in the previous classes what determines the S1 intensity. There are 5 to 6 things. And the most common is the structural integrity of mitral valve. That is why patients with mitral stenosis will have a loud S1. Patients with mitral regurgitation, because the leaflet is not good, they get a soft S1. Position of mitral valve at the time of LV contraction. In mitral stenosis, the valves are open for a longer duration, and that is why you get a loud S1. If they are closing from a shorter distance, it is causes a soft S1. Integrity of isovolumetric systole is most important. Cases like ventricular septal defect and mitral regurgitation, where the isovolumetric systole is not good, because MR causes the blood from LAV to go to the LA, VSD causes blood from LV to go to the RV, and that is why you got a soft S1 in both of these diseases. Heart rate, tachycardia causes a loud S1, bradycardia causes a soft S1. Again, the cause remains the same. PR interval, short PR interval will cause a loud S1, whereas a long PR interval will cause a soft S1. Again, the mechanism is related because a longer PR will cause the valves to close from a shorter distance, whereas the shorter PR will allow the valve to close from a longer distance. Myocardial contractility. If you have LV dysfunction, you get a soft S1, and same as LVEDP. In patients who have aortic stenosis and aortic regurgitation, there is high LVEDP which causes the premature closure of a mitral valve, uh, and that is why you get a soft S1 in AS and AR. So this is what determines the S1 intensity. Now in AF, as I already told you, you get a variable intensity of the first heart sound, and it is louder after shorter cycles. Means if you have a short RR interval, tachycardia, you get a loud S1. Whereas a long RR interval, bradycardia, you may get a normal or a soft S1 sometimes. But you should also know the other causes of variable first heart sound. The most common cause is a complete heart block. Other causes like ventricular tachycardia, you can just remember. But AF causes varying intensity of the first heart sound. As I already discussed, E to OS gap is very important, and it depends on the LA pressure. So there are factors which decreases the A to OS. So anything, as I already discussed, like severe mitral stenosis, it causes the raised LA pressure and OS happens earlier. So the A to OS is narrow. So any factor which increases the LA pressure, the two classical examples are the mitral regurgitation, which increases the LA pressure, and tachycardia, which increases the LA pressure. These two things causes a narrow A to OS gap. Like in a patient with mitral stenosis, if your A to OS is further narrow, you may think that it is because of the tachycardia or associated mitral regurgitation. Whereas any factors which increases the left ventricular end diastolic pressure, why? The LA pressure is high, and if the LVDP also becomes high, the crossover will take more time. So the opening snap will happen later. So anything which increases the LVDP, because LVDP is increased, the crossover will occur later, and that is why you get a later opening snap. Like hypertension, old age, which causes the raised LVDP, aortic stenosis causes a raised LV and diastolic pressure, bradycardia may cause raised LV and diastolic pressure. So these are the causes which increase the A to OS gap as compared to MR and tachycardia, which decreases the A to OS gap. Sometimes they may ask you in exam what are the other causes of opening snap, like the mitral stenosis, tricuspid stenosis, Epstein's anomaly, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy can cause the opening snap. So let's go to the next slide. S1 and opening snap. So what reduce the intensity? So in a patient with mitral stenosis, if you are getting a soft S1, what you should think of? So if you have a heavily calcified and a non-pliable valve, you will get a soft S1. That is the first and the foremost most common cause. If you have a severe LV dysfunction causing a low cardiac output, that will cause a soft S1 and opening snap. If you have a severe PH with RV dysfunction, which cause a reduced LV cardiac output, it will cause a soft S1 and opening snap. Again, severe LV dysfunction may cause soft S1 and opening snap. If you have a severe AR and a severe AS, you may get a soft S1 and a opening snap. So these are the causes of soft S1 and opening snap in a patient with severe mitral stenosis. We know that LV and both LVS3 and LVS4 is absent in mitral stenosis. Never tell that LVS3 and LVS4 is present with mitral stenosis, because you need an unobstructed valve for both of this, and that is why in MS you never get a LVS3 or a LVS4. What about the S2 in mitral stenosis? We know that normally the S2 will be normal unless you have a pulmonary artery hypertension. If you have a severe pulmonary artery hypertension, initially the S2 split will narrow. Why? Because we know A2 and P2. P2 will happen early in a severe PAH because the pulmonary resistance will be very high and it decreases the hangout interval. So initially in the PAH, the S2 split will narrow. However, once the patient develops RV dysfunction, the split will become wide. Why? The RV ejection is prolonged and pulmonary hangout interval is increased. And that is why P2 is delayed. So A2, P2 will be broader. But in all these cases, your P2 will be loud. In all cases of pulmonary artery hypertension, you get a widely heard. P2 will be heard loud and widely. When do you call a P2 is loud? When it is heard even at the apex. Normally, a P2 is never heard at the apex. You should only be able to hear the P2 in the pulmonary area or the aortic area. But if a pulmonary component is heard even at the apex, it is called a loud P2. And these are the in any pH you'll get a loud P2. Now let's come to the mid-diastolic murmur. You know that we get in mitral stenosis something known as the mid-diastolic murmur, and you get this murmur once the gradient between an LA and LV is more than 3 mmHg. So only a gradient more than 3 mmHg is enough to produce a murmur. Now people will ask you, where is this murmur best heard? It is only heard in the apex. The best position of this murmur is apex. You won't be able to hear it in the lower left sternal border or anywhere. It is localized to the apex. And it is the earliest murmur in mild MS. It may be pre-systolic. You will be able to hear only pre-systolic component and not the hollow diastolic murmur or the longer murmur like severe MS. You should remember that intensity is related to the velocity, but intensity is not related to the severity. In high flow, you get a louder murmur. In narrow orifice, you will get an increased velocity. But you should always remember that thrill is not a feature of MS. It is very rare to get thrill in a patient with MS as compared to a systolic thrill in MR. So MS, the thrill is very difficult to appreciate. Only in thin patients you may get a thrill. And you should know that the murmur of MS is usually a rough rumbling murmur. It is a low pitch murmur, less than 125 millihertz. Why? Because the gradient between LA and LV is less. It is a low pitch, rough rumbling, best heard with the bell of the, because it's a low pitch, it is best heard with the bell of the stethoscope. Patient in the left lateral position and breath held in expiration. Okay, so these are the points you should always tell. If you are not able to get the murmur, make the patient squat 3-4 times, make the patient walk for around 10 to 20 meters, and tell him to take few fast breaths. After that, you will be able to appreciate the murmur of a mitral stenosis. But sometimes you may not be able to hear the murmur of a mitral stenosis, where it is known as a silent MS. Murmur is there, you are not able to appreciate. Why? Sometimes because of a severe mitral stenosis, you get a reduced due to reduced flow, you are not able to appreciate a murmur. Severe PAH, where your RV enlargement is so much that you will be getting the murmur in the axilla and all, and you may miss the murmur in the apex. And that is one place where you get a silent MS. In patients with severe heart failure and cardiac LV dysfunction, your murmur may not be prominent. Then in the patient with extensive calcification of the valve, you may not be able to hear a murmur or a S1 loud or a opening snap. If the patient has associated severe AR, AS or a atrial septal defect, we know that in patients with Lutembacher means AS with ASD with MS, because the atrial septal defect is there, all the blood from LA is going to the RA, and so the murmur may not be prominent. One also important cause is the presence of tricuspid stenosis. If the patient has tricuspid stenosis, then you may not be able to appreciate a mitral stenosis murmur. And more common cause, if they ask you an exam, if it patient is obese and the thick chest wall or COPD, then you will not be able to appreciate the murmur of MS. So here I would like to hold in MS. If any questions are there, I'll just take one or two questions before moving to the next session of MR. MR is a shorter topic we may finish earlier. So if any question you can ask, you can unmute and ask. Otherwise, I'll proceed. The most important thing is the murmur of mitral stenosis, which all of you should know. And in the previous classes, I have discussed the other differential diagnosis of a mid-diastolic murmur, which definitely they will ask you in exam, like the flow murmurs of VSD PD on the left side or the ASD on the right side. Then the flow murmur is the Austin Flint murmur, which is a mid-diastolic murmur. Then Graham Still murmur. Then you can have a Carey-Coombs murmur. Then you can have a other causes like complete heart block, right arms murmur. So these are the other causes of a mid-diastolic murmur or flow states like the anemia thyrotoxicosis, high output state. So you should remember the other causes of a mid-diastolic murmur also. Just excuse me for a second. Sorry. So I'll proceed to the next important session on mitral regurgitation. So this is the picture of a mitral regurgitation. Most of you may not be would have seen this, but we at MD level, most of us do not go into the echo details of a mitral regurgitation. But there are some things which should in clinically which we should know about mitral regurgitation. One about the mechanism. So we know that the mechanism can be of two types. It can be a primary or it can be secondary. Primary is mainly due to a rheumatic heart disease or a mitral valve prolapse, where there is an abnormal mitral valve apparatus like the commissure, like the leaflet and all. The secondary is in the patients with LV dysfunction, where there is an annular dilatation, where I told you it's called MR begets MR. So patient with ischemic heart disease, chronic ischemic heart disease, or a dilated cardiomyopathy, you get a functional MR. In a primary MR, you should remember that these are the central jet, and that is why you get a pan-systolic murmur in patients with rheumatic heart disease. In patients with mitral valve prolapse, you may get a late systolic murmur with a mid ejection click, and the S1 may be loud and normal. So this is how you differentiate a rheumatic MR from a mitral valve prolapse MR. Functional murmurs are different. You sometimes get an acute MR, like in a patient with acute infective endocarditis, or in the patient with acute MI due to acute MR. You get this type of things. In patient with dilated cardiomyopathy, most of the time we are not able to hear a murmur. But if you get a murmur, you get an MR murmur, it is due to annular dilatation. So let's discuss about the symptoms in chronic severe MR. I told you two symptoms are very important. The most common symptom of MR, chronic MR, is fatigue. Patient gets exertional fatigue. Why? Because effective forward stroke volume or the cardiac output is reduced. Because you know that MR, the blood from the LV goes to the LA. So whatever is in the LV has to eject. The forward effective cardiac output will be reduced, and that is why you get exertional fatigue. But what happens that all the LA blood later will come to the LV, and the heart tries to pump that blood. And that is why, because of the volume overload, you get palpitations. You get exertional palpitation in mitral regurgitation and aortic regurgitation. These palpitations are exertional, unlike arrhythmia where you get palpitations at rest. So this is something which you should know. But in MR, the patient remains asymptomatic for a very long period of time. This is something which you should know. Patient develop symptoms very late, and unless they develop, by the time they develop symptoms, the patient LV is already very dilated. And dyspnea is a very late symptom. So never tell when the patient has dyspnea that it is because of MR. Always tell MS, MS, MS. It's not MR, it's MS. Dyspnea is equal to MS. Fatigue is equal to MR or AR. But still in AR, the predominant symptoms remains the palpitations. In MR, the predominant symptom is the fatigue. And then you should ask about the history of endocarditis, fever and all. So as I already discussed, dyspnea in MR is usually very late, and it is due to LV dysfunction which occurs very late. And if the patient with MR has a rapid progression, some patient with MR is suddenly worsened fast, what you should think of is first recurrence of a rheumatic activity. Patient has chronic MR, but some acute rheumatic fever has happened. Second, caudal rupture. It is can be spontaneous, it can be because of the endocarditis, and sometimes it can be because of a rheumatic fever. Third is infected patient may have fever, and also you should think of a endocarditis. And then the onset of atrial fibrillation, though more common in mitral stenosis, in MR also you can, because of the dilated LA, have a AF which causes a prominent V wave. Left-sided V waves will be prominent. And hypertension, one of the important things is the patient has hypertension, the MR will worsen because the afterload is increasing, and that is why MR will worsen. Now, what are the causes of chest pain? MR itself doesn't have chest pain unless it is associated with mitral valve prolapse. We know that most of the mitral valve prolapse have atypical angina, not very typical. They are thin, young patient, usually female, thin chest wall. They may have thyrotoxicosis, straight back syndrome, and they have atypical chest pain. But sometimes it can be typical chest pain also because of the myocardial ischemia and due to abnormal tension on the papillary muscles. Two causes: one is due to myocardial ischemia, second due to abnormal tension on papillary muscle. They can have typical chest pain. In ECG, you get inferior wall changes, ST depression in the inferior leads. And most of this female, when you do a treadmill test, they will have a false positive. You think that it is positive, but it is usually a false positive. So these are the things you should think about the mitral valve prolapse. What about the clinical features of chronic severe MR? Now we have discussed about MS. What about MR? MR, you should remember one about the pulse. What type of pulse you get in MR is a mini collapsing pulse. It is called a mini water hammer pulse because water hammer pulse is a high amplitude pulse with a wide pulse pressure. In MR, the pulse pressure is normal, but it's a jerky. The upstroke is very fast, but you get a normal pulse pressure and it's not a wide pulse pressure. That is why it's called mini collapsing pulse. It's a jerky type of pulse. But what determines the severity of mitral regurgitation is the cardiomegaly. If you have a cardiomegaly with a down and out hyperdynamic apex, we know that the apex is of three types: tapping apex, heaving apex, hyperdynamic. Tapping apex we discussed. It is an apex which is in the same fifth intercostal space within the mid clavicular line. It doesn't lift your finger, it touches your finger and go off, and it is associated with a loud S1. What is a hyperdynamic apex? Is a apex is shifted down and out. It raises your finger but less than half of the systole. So that is hyperdynamic, but it should be shifted down and out. Sixth intercostal space outside the mid clavicular line. What is a heaving apex? Is a heaving apex is in the same space. Fifth, it has moved out outside the mid clavicular line. It is because of the pressure hypertrophy. Because of the pressure hypertrophy, you get a sustained, it raises your finger for more than half to two-thirds of the systole. You get in pressure overload condition like coarctation of aorta, aortic stenosis, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and all that. Whereas in a volume overload, you get a hyperdynamic. So cardiomegaly is a feature of severe MR. Late systolic parasternal pulsation. We know that there is something known as the parasternal heave, but there is also something known as the parasternal lift. In MR, you can get a parasternal lift because the LA is so big that whenever the blood is coming to the LA, it is raising your fingers. It is difficult to differentiate it from the parasternal hue, but parasternal hue is well sustained, whereas a lift or a parasternal pulsations are ill sustained. They come in the later part of the systole, whereas the parasternal hue is pansystolic. So these two things you should know. Another important features of chronic severe MR is a wide split S2, because the A2 is early in MR. It's by mistake it's written it's early A2. What happened is in the MR all the blood from LV is going to the LA, so your aortic valve will close early, and that is causing the early A2. So A2 P2 it causes a wide and variable split. LVS3 and flow murmur across the mitral valve. MDM across the mitral valve and LVS3 are a feature of severe mitral regurgitation. Intensity of the murmur is not related to severity. Thrill is not related to the severity of MR. Pulmonary hypertension occurs very late in the disease, so you should think of associated mitral stenosis first rather than thinking that the disease is very late. So think of associated mitral stenosis first in MR when you have a pulmonary artery hypertension. As I already told you, what type of pulse do you get in MR? You get a carotid upstroke is very sharp, quick rising. You get a small water MR because your pulse volume is normal or decreased, but you get a brisk rise. So that is called a small water hammer pulse. Blood pressure, it does not make any difference. So blood pressure is usually normal. Apical impulse, I told you, it is hyperdynamic, shifted down and out. However, in a patient with MR, if patient develops LV dysfunction, you'll get a sustained or a LV dysfunction apex. So what is the LV dysfunction apex is you'll get a diffuse apex, but it is heaving type. A RV apex is only a diffuse apex, whereas the LV apex is diffuse and sustained. It is raising your finger up. But what is the late systolic pulsation? As I already discussed, the anterior cardiac chambers, there is an outward movement like the LA, it will move outward. So how do you differentiate? It is asynchronous with the LV apex. The parasternal lift is asynchronous, whereas the parasternal hue is usually synchronous with the RV apex. You get a late systolic lift, whereas the parasternal hue is pansystolic. The lift is usually ill sustained, whereas the parasternal hue is well sustained. What happens to S1 in MR? You already know, because the integrity of the valve is gone, you get a soft S1. Other causes are the absence of isovolumetric systole, as I already discussed, and then early onset of MR during isovolumic systole. It may mask or it may blur the S1. You may not be able to hear a good S1. So other causes of loss of isovolumic systole, as I already discussed, is ventricular septal defect and LV aneurysm, and even AR, aortic regurgitation. And that is why you get a soft S1 in all these diseases. How do you differentiate a mitral valve prolapse from a rheumatic MR? Is you get a normal or a loud S1, you get a mid systolic click, and you get a late systolic murmur. MR rheumatic has a pan systolic murmur, no click, and a soft S1. This will definitely, they will ask you in exam. So if the S1 is loud in MR, what you should think? First, you should think that there is associated mitral stenosis. Always think that there is associated mitral stenosis. Second is you should think about the mitral valve prolapse, which may cause the normal or loud S1. So these are the causes of a loud S1 in mitral regurgitation. What happens to the S2? I told you S2, if the split is normally normal, if you get a wide and variable split, it tells that the MR is very severe. Why? Because you get early A2, because the LV ejection time is reduced. What happens if you have a narrow split? One, it means that the LV dysfunction has set in and the A2 is delayed. So you get a narrow split. Second is because of the pulmonary hangover. If you have a pulmonary artery hypertension, you get a narrow split in MR. And PAH P2 will be loud. S3 and S4. I told you S3 is a feature of severe MR. In all the MR, chronic MR and acute MR, you'll definitely get a S3, because S3 is a feature of heart failure also, and it is a feature of a dilated LV. What happens to S4? S4 is absent in chronic severe MR, mainly in the rheumatic. Why? Because the compliant LV atrial boost is not needed. LV atrial boost is not needed because the LV is compliant and the LA is damaged because of the previous rheumatic carditis, and that is why you do not get a S4 in chronic severe MR. When do you get a loud S4? There are few causes like acute MR, you get a loud S4, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and coronary artery disease, you get a loud S4. So these are the causes of S4 which you should know: acute MR, systemic hypertension, coronary artery disease, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Now, what about the murmur? We know, all of us know, we get a loud, soft blowing pan-systolic murmur. You may not be able to hear the first heart sound, and even it goes beyond A2 and it may obscure the A2. And that is why many of the time we are not able to hear even the first heart sound and the second heart sound because of the pan-systolic murmur. If you have a only early systolic murmur, think that it is a acute MR and not a chronic MR. Then you should think about endocarditis, ischemic heart disease like the papillary muscle rupture and all. Chronic MR will usually have a pan-systolic murmur. What about MVP? MVP MR will have a mid to late systolic murmur, mid systolic click, and a loud or a normal first heart sound. Ischemic MR sometimes produces even late systolic murmur in papillary muscle dysfunction. Otherwise, most of the time it causes the early systolic murmur. In MR also, HOCM, MR in HOCM is usually a pan systolic murmur. So these are the few other things which we should know. Now, many of the time you get a patient with aortic stenosis and you are getting a Gallaverdin type of murmur. The murmur of AS sometimes can radiate to the axilla, and you will think that it is a MR is also there and a AS is also there. How do you differentiate? One of the important thing is you don't get a beat to beat variation. In AS, there is a beat to beat variation because it is outflow murmur. That is why if a patient has ectopic or a preventricular contraction beat, after that beat, because the LV gets more blood and it ejects, the AS murmur will increase. Whereas MR murmur doesn't have any beat to beat variation either with AF or a premature ventricular complex. This I won't go into detail the mechanism. Now, what happens to the MR murmur? I told you one important thing to you is three important things which distinguishes the MVP from a rheumatic. The fourth thing is the site of radiation. If a MR murmur is radiate towards the base, it means it has involved the anterior mitral, posterior mitral leaflet, and that is why MVP usually radiate towards the base of the heart, whereas the rheumatic heart disease usually radiate towards the axilla and the infrascapular area. So, because it involves the anterior mitral leaflet, and you get the jet directed posteriorly. In in sorry, in patients with mitral valve prolapse, it is most commonly a posterior mitral leaflet involvement, and you get a anterolateral jet, and that is why it radiates towards the base of the heart. What are the other conditions where the murmur of MR will go towards the base of the heart? Is one is PML prolapse. Second is if there is a severe caudal rupture in a patient with MR, you get the murmur at the base of the heart. In the MR, if the patient has AV canal defect with MR, you get a base of the heart, and in the congenital character TGA, it is a congenital heart disease with left AV valve regurgitation. For you, you should just remember two causes. One is MVP MR usually goes to the base of the heart, and MI with caudal rupture usually go toward the base of the heart. When do you get a silent MR? As I already told you, dilated cardiomyopathy is one disease where you get all the muffled heart sound. S1 will be soft, S2 will be soft. You won't be able to hear except S3 any other sound, and all the murmurs will be soft. So dilated cardiomyopathy, you may get a silent MR. An MR due to coronary artery disease, where you get acute short systolic murmur, you may get a silent MR. Even in patients with prosthetic valves, if they develop mitral regurgitation, it will be a silent MR. And sometimes in patients with COPD, obesity, and chest wall deformity. As I told you, if in patient with MR you get a mid diastolic murmur, it indicates that it is a severe mitral regurgitation. It is a low pitched mid diastolic murmur, and it may be associated with a thrill. It is suggestive of severe MR. But what are the causes of absent MDM in a severe MR is, if you have a patient with LV dysfunction, you may not be able to get a mid diastolic murmur. ASD with MR, you won't get a mid-diastolic murmur, and in acute MR also you don't get a mid-diastolic murmur. So how do you distinguish between a patient with acute MR and a chronic MR? See, first is common sense. Patient with acute MR will be very sick. They will present with hypotension. They will have pulmonary edema and all those things. They will have hypotension. They will have pulmonary edema. Pulse won't be mini collapsing. It will be a alternance pulse, or it will be a thready pulse. You will get a high JVP. S1 will be soft. S2 will be loud, because acute MR, the pulmonary venous hypertension is very early. They develop PH and loud P2. S3 is invariable. All the case will get S3, and S4 will be loud in acute MR. You will get a S4 also. You won't get a down and out apex like a chronic MR. You won't get a pansystolic murmur. You'll get an early systolic murmur. It is only a decrescendo murmur. Patient. So all these findings you should know about a chronic versus a acute MR. I think today we'll just end on to the discussion with the mitral valve disease. Tomorrow we'll have a discussion about the aortic valve disease. So we'll do the continuation of the yesterday's class. Yesterday, I'll just revise in 5 minutes what we discussed yesterday. We discussed about the valvular heart disease, mitral stenosis, and mitral regurgitation. So what we discussed in mitral stenosis are the typical symptoms, which are dyspnea, orthopnea, PND, and then we have hemoptysis, and then pressure symptoms like the dysphagia or the hoarseness of voice, and finally the patient will have right-sided heart failure symptoms like ascites pedal edema. When you come to the examination, the assessment of severe mitral stenosis, which includes a long mid-diastolic murmur and a narrow A to OS gap, and a signs of pulmonary artery hypertension. Then we also discussed what thing affects the A to OS gap, like the things which increase the LA pressure and the things which increase the LVEDP. Then we also discussed about the complications of mitral stenosis, which are related to the severity and which are not related to the severity. And then we saw about the mitral regurgitation. What are the signs of severe mitral regurgitation? What is the etiology of mitral regurgitation? What is the difference between acute and chronic mitral regurgitation? And the other findings in mitral regurgitation. Now we'll come to one important topic, which is aortic stenosis. Most of the time you will get a short case, or sometimes rarely a long case in your DM or DNB examination, which is aortic stenosis. Most of the time this aortic stenosis will be degenerative, but rarely if you get an isolated aortic stenosis, it can also be a bicuspid aortic valve. And finally, the rare cause of an isolated AS is rheumatic heart disease, which should be told in the end. So the three main causes of aortic stenosis on the order of priority are degenerative, followed by bicuspid aortic valve, and finally a rheumatic heart disease. So let's discuss about the aortic stenosis. Now, as I already told, the three major causes are rheumatic, and invariably in rheumatic aortic valve, mitral valve is invariably involved, because isolated aortic stenosis is a case report. So it doesn't happen usually. And if it is aortic stenosis, mitral valve has to be invariably involved if it is a rheumatic. In congenital aortic stenosis, most common is a bicuspid aortic valve. We know it is more common in the younger population, age 40 to 50 years. They have an ejection click. They have a loud A2. So that is difference comparison to the rheumatic, where there is no ejection click. A2 is soft most of the times. And finally, the most common presentation in the people who are age 60 years or more is degenerative. So most commonly, if you see only aortic stenosis in an adult male around 70 years, it will be degenerative, and around 12% over 75 years will have degenerative aortic stenosis. Now, there are some rare causes which includes familial hypercholesterolemia. It is mainly the type 2 hyperlipoproteinemia, which is associated with aortic stenosis. Then we can have things like radiation-induced rheumatoid arthritis, Paget's disease, ochronosis, and other things like chronic kidney disease and all. Most of the things usually precipitate, because all these are associated with calcification, and that is why they precipitate aortic stenosis. So you should know the rare causes also. There are certain genes which is involved with aortic stenosis, like polymorphism in ACE1 polymorphism. ACE converting enzyme polymorphism is usually associated with aortic stenosis. So these are the few things you should know about the aortic stenosis. Now let's discuss about the symptom. You will know the classical triad symptoms of aortic stenosis is angina, syncope, and dyspnea. So this is the classical triad: angina, syncope, and dyspnea. But you should always remember that the patients with aortic stenosis, most of the time when they present to you, will be asymptomatic. And if the patient with aortic stenosis is symptomatic, it means he has reached a level of LV dysfunction. Let it be a LV systolic dysfunction, means the EF has decreased, or a LV diastolic dysfunction where the EF is more than 50%. But they will have some form of LV dysfunction if they have developed symptom. And the most common symptom in a patient with AS is dyspnea on exertion. We already discussed yesterday what is the difference between the dyspnea in mitral stenosis and aortic stenosis. In mitral stenosis, the mechanism of dyspnea is because the LA pressure is high. That is why all the LA pressure is transmitted to the capillary wedge pressure and the patient had dyspnea. In aortic stenosis, the dyspnea is because of the raised LV end diastolic pressure, which increases the LA pressure and causes the dyspnea. And that is why AS, if they develop dyspnea, it is a downhill course. Once they develop dyspnea, the survival is only 2 years. Whereas in mitral stenosis, if they develop dyspnea, the patient can still live for long, and it is still reversible if you do balloon mitral valvotomy and all. So that is one difference between the dyspnea in mitral stenosis, and dyspnea in aortic stenosis occurs very late, whereas the dyspnea in mitral stenosis occurs very early. So the patient most common symptom is dyspnea on exertion because of LV dysfunction, systolic or diastolic, and low cardiac output. Most of the time in aortic stenosis, the cardiac output is usually preserved until to the late stage where the cardiac output may decrease, which may produce fatigue symptoms. We know that the angina is also a classical symptom of aortic stenosis. Almost 35 to 50% will have angina, and patient who have angina, 50% will have coronary artery disease. So coronary artery disease may be present in 50% of the patient with aortic stenosis. Now, what are the causes of angina in AS? We'll discuss in the next slide. The next important symptom is the syncope and exertion, or a dyspnea or dizziness, or a pre-syncope. Where 15 to 30% can have a dizziness, pre-syncope, or a syncope on exertion. Again, three important mechanisms are there, which we'll discuss in the next two slides. Finally, the patient may present with the lower GI bleeding, which is due to the angiodysplasia of the colon. You may be knowing it because it's also called as Hayday syndrome, and it is due to the defective multimerization of the von Willebrand factor. It is related to the von Willebrand factor multimerization. It is defective in patient with aortic stenosis and is known as the angiodysplasia of the colon. Most commonly involves the right side of the colon than the left side. So all patients with aortic stenosis, if they have severe anemia, you should always rule out angiodysplasia, because once you change the valve, when you replace the valve, it goes off itself. You do not need separate treatment. It improves by itself. Now, what are the causes of angina in aortic stenosis? This is the most common question you will be asked in exam if the patient has angina. So there are 5 to 6 important causes. The most common is that supply demand mismatch. Why? Because there is a hypertrophied myocardium, which causes the increased demand. Also, in patients with aortic stenosis, we know that because of aortic stenosis, systole is prolonged, and so the diastole is reduced. Because of shortened diastole, the coronary perfusion pressure is reduced. Also, because of the AS, the LVEDP is increased, which causes the decreased coronary perfusion pressure. So there are two causes. One is shortened diastole, and second is raised LVEDP causes the decreased coronary perfusion pressure, causing more angina. Prolonged systole increase the LV ejection time and causes the increased wall stress, which may again cause angina. In patients with aortic stenosis, also the capillary density is reduced, which may cause angina, and they 50% may have associated coronary artery disease, which can cause angina. So these are the all causes of angina in patients with aortic stenosis. If you remember 3 to 4 important, also it is fair enough. Now, why do patients develop dyspnea? As I already discussed, dyspnea is very late presentation in AS, and once they develop dyspnea, it is a downhill course. The survival is only 2 years without any intervention, and it is due to LV systolic dysfunction or a diastolic dysfunction, and it is due to raised LV and diastolic pressure. Dizziness has three important mechanisms, and it is usually exertional. You should always remember that unless the patient has arrhythmias and all, the dizziness in AS is usually exertional syncope. First is because of the fixed LVOTO, because it's not like HOCM where the LVOTO is dynamic. Here the LVOTO is fixed, which causes syncope. And second is because of the fixed LVOTO, when the LV tries to contract, it causes the activation of baroreceptor, which decreases the systemic vascular resistance, and because of which patient peripheral runoff is there and the patient gets a syncope. And this is known as the Bezold-Zeres reflex. So what happens is because of the increased LV contraction, the baroreceptors are activated, which decreases the SVR and causes the vasodilatation and the hypotension known as the Bezold-Zeres reflex, and that is why it causes the syncope. Other mechanisms may be because of the arrhythmias, which are important. And finally, sometimes the AS can have conduction block because of the severe calcification in the aortic valve. This calcification can extend to the conduction system and may present with complete heart block. Though it is a rare thing, you should always remember this as a cause of syncope in patient with aortic stenosis. Now let's discuss the clinical features of severe aortic stenosis. We have already discussed in the history what all you have to ask. In examination, what all things tells that the aortic stenosis is severe. When you examine the pulse, most of the patient in a mild to moderate AS will have a normal pulse. But when you have a severe aortic stenosis, it will be a pulsus parvus et tardus. It has a parvus also and a tardus also. You know what is parvus, I think. So the parvus means small volume. Tardus means late peaking. So a small volume and a late peaking pulse is known as the pulsus parvus et tardus. Not all the patient will have both parvus et tardus. Some patient may have parvus, some patient may have tardus, and some patient may have both parvus et tardus also. So parvus is small volume and tardus is late peaking. Now, second important feature of severity is low systolic blood pressure with narrow pulse pressure, which you also call it as systolic decapitation. So systolic decapitation may be an important feature of severe aortic stenosis, but sometime in the patient who are elderly, who have associated hypertension, the systolic decapitation may not be present. Apicocarotid delay is an important feature of severe aortic stenosis, because for that what you have to do is you have to auscultate the apical impulse, and with the hand you have to feel the carotid pulse. Normally you should not be able to get any discrepancy or any difference between the apical pulse and the carotid pulse, because the normal time for the apical impulse to reach the carotid pulse is around 30 milliseconds, and it is very difficult for our ears to appreciate this 30 milliseconds. So any difference which is appreciated is known as the apicocarotid delay, and it is a feature of severe aortic stenosis. And next is a heaving apical impulse, but it and not displaced. Any heaving apical impulse is a feature of severe aortic stenosis, because there is so much of pressure overload which causes a severe AS. Next is a paradoxical split. We know that normally on inspiration the split increases and the expiration the split closes off. So the name paradoxical split suggests that on expiration you are able to hear a split, whereas on inspiration you are not able to hear a split. And that is why, because why does it happen is because of the severe aortic stenosis, the LV ejection is late, and that is why aortic valve closes late, and aortic valve goes near the pulmonary sound, and sometimes you may be able to get a single second heart sound, sometimes you may be able to hear a paradoxical second heart sound. And then is a LVS4. A palpable LVS4 usually tells that the aortic stenosis is severe, and that even auscultatory LVS4 will tell that the aortic stenosis is severe, and it tells that the gradient between the LV and aorta is more than 75 millimeter of mercury. So it can even tell you the gradient between the LV and the aorta. Next is the late peaking murmur. A long murmur and the late peaking murmur is suggestive of a severe aortic stenosis. So these are the points to tell that a aortic stenosis is severe. Now let's come to the carotid pulse. There is a delayed upstroke. As I already discussed, it's a slow rising and a late peaking, and not just the low volume. It is relatively specific for severe aortic stenosis. Sometimes we also get something known as the anacrotic pulse. Normally, an anacrotic pulse you won't be able to appreciate in a radial or a carotid, because it is a phonocardiographic finding. It a delayed rising pulse or the slow peaking pulse, which has an anacrotic notch on its upslope, is known as an anacrotic pulse, and it is a slow rising pulse with a notch or the shoulder in the ascending limb. that is all only recorded by a phonocardiogram, and you cannot feel that pulse. So that is something you should remember. And you should always remember that rarely in patients who have AS with LV dysfunction, you may be able to get a pulses alternance. So these are all the pulses you should know in a patient with aortic stenosis. Now, as I already told you, pulses parvus et tardas, but you should also remember that there may be sometimes the false negative findings of pulsus parvus et tardas, that even if it is there, you may not be able to appreciate because it is masked. And when does it mask is in children's and young adults, because of the high cardiac output and elastic vessels, you may not be able to appreciate a pulsus parvus et tardas. In elderly, because of the increased stiffness of the vessels, you may not be able to appreciate. If the patient has associated severe AR, you may not be able to appreciate because it may be masked. In patients with hypertension also, it may be masked. And supravalvular AS on the right side, this may be masked. So these are the things which may mask the pulsus parvus et tardas, and also the congestive cardiac failure because of the low stroke volume. So you may not be able to get even both the, you may be able to hear the parvus but not the tardas thing. So that is something you should always remember, that when does this gets masked. Now what happens to the blood pressure? In systolic blood pressure is usually most of the time in mild to moderate, it is preserved. In severe aortic stenosis, because of the systolic decapitation, it is lower. In diastolic, blood pressure is usually high because of the LVH and diastolic dysfunction, and it is because of the vasoconstriction, and that is why you get a narrow pulse pressure in patients with aortic stenosis. Narrow pulse pressure with systolic decapitation is a feature of severe aortic stenosis. In elderly, you may not be able to get systolic decapitation, and most of the time, if they are associated with systemic hypertension, you may not be able to get systolic decapitation. So this questions people may ask you, you should remember. I already discussed about the apical-carotid delay. It is a lag between the systolic thrust at the apex and the peak of carotid impulse. And it has a high sensitivity and specificity and positive predictive value for the diagnosis of severe aortic stenosis. So after the carotid pulse, let's discuss about the heart sounds. So what happened to the heart sound? We know that the S1 is normal most of the time in aortic stenosis unless the patient has a LV dysfunction. If the patient has a LV dysfunction, the S1 may be soft. As I already discussed yesterday, there are many factors which determine the uh, intensity of the S1, which include the integrity of the valve, the isovolumetric systole, the heart rate, the PR interval, and the distance from which the leaflets close. So in patients with aortic stenosis, if the patient has LV dysfunction because of the raised LVEDP, there is a premature closure of the mitral valve, which causes a soft S1. So this you should always remember. S2 is always important. I'll come in the next slide. But before that, let's discuss about S3. S3 in aortic stenosis signifies LV dysfunction. Let it be systolic dysfunction or diastolic dysfunction. So patient is in heart failure for sure if you have a LVS3 in aortic stenosis. S4 is a pathognomic of severe aortic stenosis that you should always know. Most of the time, if you are able to palpate a S4, it means the gradient between the LV and the aorta is more than 70 mm of Hg. However, if you are not able to palpate and it's only a audible S4, then you may sometimes get confused that it may be because of associated coronary artery disease or a hypertension and other causes. But if you get S4 in aortic stenosis, it means it is a severe aortic stenosis. However, if the patient has associated atrial fibrillation, then the S4 will be absent. Now, S2, we all know why you get a soft S2 in patient with aortic stenosis, and many people may ask you, when do you don't get a soft S2? S2 may be loud or normal if the patient is elderly sometimes because of a sclerodegenerative valve or a sclerotic aortic valve disease, and patient and then hypertensive individuals where S2 may sometimes be loud. Otherwise, S2 has to be soft in aortic stenosis because there is a uh, pliable and a non-calcified pliable and a calcified valve. In patients with bicuspid aortic valve, where if it is not calcified and it is pliable, you get a normal or a loud A2. However, if it is calcified like in degenerative, you get a soft A2. In aged 40 to 50 years of individual, when the aortic valve is pliable and it is non-calcified, you get a loud A2 with a ejection click. As I already told you, the split is usually narrow, or you may get a paradoxical split. Why? Because the A2 is delayed, and sometimes the A2 is inaudible, and it may be buried in the P2. And that is why you may sometimes able to get a paradoxical split, which also tells that the AS is severe and the gradient between LV and the aorta is more than 75 mm of Hg. Now, aortic ejection click is a feature of a bicuspid aortic valve. You get in a pliable, non-calcified valve, and the best place to appreciate a aortic ejection click is the apex of the heart. It is a non-phasic, it is a constant, it does not vary with inspiration or expiration, so it is a constant click. More commonly, you get in younger male, which is less than 40 years, because beyond 40 years, the valves get unpliable or calcified and you do not get a ejection click. It is a sign of bicuspid aortic valve and not a feature of rheumatic heart disease, and it has no relation with the severity of aortic stenosis. These are the few points you should know about the aortic ejection click. Now, what happens to the murmur? We know you will be able, most of the time, all of you would have listened the murmur of the aortic stenosis. It is a rough murmur, ejection systolic murmur. It is a crescendo, decrescendo murmur, best heard in the aortic area with the diaphragm of the stethoscope, with the patient sitting in, leaning forward and the breath held in expiration. And if it is due to a sclerodegenerative valve, you may be able to see a Gallawerdin phenomena where the murmur high intensity frequencies, the eddy currents, are heard at the apex. So that is known as the Gallawerdin phenomena. If the murmur has a late peaking and a longer murmur, it tells that the murmur is, or the aortic stenosis is severe, and it is associated with a soft A2. So this is about the murmur, and most of the time, if you will be able to get a musical murmur, and that murmur is also known as the Gallawerdin phenomena. And most of the time, you may be think that it is a mitral regurgitation also along with AS. But you should always remember 2-3 points. If it is a MR, the patient won't have a beat to beat variation. Suppose you are having a post systolic beat or a PVC or a AF. In AF and all, there is a beat to beat variation in the murmur in aortic stenosis, but in MR there is no beat to beat variation. In the MR with the hand gripping, the murmur will increase, whereas in AS with hand gripping, the murmur will decrease. Why? Because the LV systolic pressure is increased. That is why the gradient between LV and aorta will decrease, and that is why the murmur will decrease in AS with hand gripping. MR murmur will increase on hand gripping. These are the few things you should know to differentiate between a murmur of a MR and AS. Also, in a patient, if a AS develop LV dysfunction, you should know what findings will change. So if the patient with AS develops LV dysfunction, the murmur will soften and it may be even absent. The S1 will become soft, as I already told you. S2, you will definitely get a paradoxical split. S3 will be there. S4 it will be there. Murmur will become low intensity. Murmur will become soft and even absent. You may not be able to appreciate a parvus at tardus. You may be able to get a pulsus alternans also in many of the cases, and the apex becomes diffuse and heaving instead of a localized heaving. It becomes a diffuse and the heaving apex. So these are the things you get in AS once they develop LV dysfunction. So this was about the AS. If anybody has any doubt, I can interrupt for a minute and then I will answer the question. Anybody has any doubt in AS? Shall I proceed? Okay.
Sir, aortic stenosis versus sclerotic aortic wall, only loud S2 is the differentiating feature, sir, or any other
Yeah.
differentiating feature?
Most of the time, when you get a sclerodegenerative valve, it is not a severe aortic stenosis. Means you should remember that a sclerotic aortic valve it usually has a mild to moderate AS. It doesn't have a severe AS. If they proceed to degenerate severe AS, then you may not be able to classify, okay, to differentiate. However, most of the time, the sclerotic aortic valve will have a mild to moderate AS. And then how do you differentiate is whatever is the point of severe AS, like a heaving apical impulse. You don't get a heaving apical impulse in this. You don't get a loud S2. In a sclerotic valve, you get a loud A2. In a severe AS, you get a soft A2. Carotid thrill will be present in both, but a late peaking murmur and a longer murmur won't be there in a sclerotic aortic valve. Paradoxical split won't be there. S4 may not be there unless the patient is hypertensive. So all the features of severe AS won't be there in sclerotic aortic valve. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Not only your heart sound, but your late peaking murmur, your paradoxical split, your heaving apex, carotid thrill may still be there. That is one thing which will be there in both. But other things of severe aortic stenosis won't be there in a sclerotic aortic valve disease.
Okay, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'll proceed. So next is the important is the aortic regurgitation. This isolated AR will be difficult to get in examination because most of the time isolated AR like isolated AS doesn't happen. Most of the time you may get isolated AR in again a bicuspid aortic valve or a patient who develops infective endocarditis. You will have acute AR. Otherwise, most of them are associated with mitral valve disease as a rheumatic feature. So it may be due to the primary disease of the aortic valve like rheumatic heart disease, bicuspid aortic valve, and endocarditis, or it may be due to the root disease like Marfan syndrome and the bicuspid aortic valve, which causes root dilatation. Some other causes of AR are iatrogenic AR due to the trauma, due to the radiation, or sometimes it may be due to ankylosing spondylitis and all, which has a associated AR. So these are the causes of AR, which all of you should know. Apart from that, connective tissue disorder, Takayasu arteritis, Marfan syndrome, osteogenesis imperfecta. These are the various 10 to 15 causes are there, but you can just divide it into the diseases of the aortic valve and diseases of the root. And that is, and this is how you people will ask you in examination, how did you differentiate a rheumatic from a root cause? In rheumatic AR, the S1, the second heart sound is usually soft. If it is due to a root disease, because it's a dilated aorta, you get a loud S2, A2. Second, in a rheumatic AR, you get, where do you get the best murmur? You heard the best murmur on the left side in the herbs area. If it is due to the aortic root, you get the best murmur on the right side in the second intercostal space. Rheumatic AR has a different intense pitch of the murmur, whereas due to root dilatation, you get a musical quality of the murmur. So these are the points of differentiation if they ask you in exam the difference between a rheumatic and a aortic root disease AR. I'll discuss this point again in the next few slides. But what are the symptoms of a chronic AR? You should always know. Like aortic stenosis, till very late stage, the patient with AR will be asymptomatic, and only once the LV starts dilating, the patient will develop the symptom. There are two predominant symptoms of AR. The first is exertional palpitation. Why? Because of the volume overload. The LV is so much dilated that there is volume overload, which causes the exertional palpitation. In MR also it is common, very common. However, the predominant symptom of a MR is exertional fatigue because the effective forward stroke volume is reduced. However, both may present with exertional palpitation. Patient may have a marked systemic vasodilatation causing increased sweating and warm flushed skin. One important symptom is throbbing pulsations of the neck. It is a very specific symptom of a chronic aortic regurgitation that patient may have a, because of the volume overload, throbbing pulsations in the neck. Angina is a late feature, and angina, it may even be able to tell that what is the etiology, like a syphilitic AR, if it is due to syphilitic AR or a autoarteritis. I'll discuss in the next slide why it causes a nocturnal angina. So history of nocturnal angina is very important in AR, and you should always ask. Dyspnea is a very late symptom, and once the dyspnea is there, it means the patient has developed LV dysfunction in aortic regurgitation. And once it occurs, it is a rapid deterioration in a patient once it developed LV dysfunction. So that is why you should remember this thing. Now, angina is AR is a prominent, it is very late in the course. The mechanism remains the same as AS because of the supply demand mismatch. LV coronary perfusion pressures are reduced. And why do you get nocturnal angina? People may ask you, why do you get nocturnal angina in AR? So what happens in during sleep, there is a decrease in the heart rate, which prolongs the diastole and increases the LVEDP. If the diastole is prolonged, we know LVEDP will be increased, and that decreases the coronary perfusion pressure and coronary blood flow. So this one mechanism you should always remember. Once the patient is sleeping, heart rate decreases, prolongs the diastole, increases the LVDP. Once the LVDP is increased, it decreases the coronary perfusion pressure and coronary blood flow. That is why you get a nocturnal angina. Also, diastolic coronary stealing with a flow reversal due to Venturi effect of ARZ. That is another mechanism. You may just know the name. Due to Venturi effect, there is a diastolic coronary steal phenomena. So these are the mechanisms of nocturnal angina in AR. Why do you get dyspnea? Due to LV dysfunction, there is a raised LV and diastolic pressure. Very late it happens, and once dyspnea happens, patient progresses very fast, worsens very fast, and that is why the progression to dyspnea is very late in patient with AR. But if a patient with AR has early dyspnea, you should think of two things: associated mitral stenosis and acute AR. But the patient with acute AR will definitely be very sick in pulmonary edema, hypotension, PAH, and all. And so you'll be able to know. But if a stable patient with AR has a dyspnea, you should always think that there is associated mitral stenosis, which may be causing dyspnea. And if there is a rapid progression of the dyspnea, you should also think that the patient may have endocarditis and systemic hypertension. So these are the few things you should know in the history. Next, coming to the clinical features of a severe AR, you already know that the severe AR may have two important things. One, signs of wide pulse pressure, like you know all the 14, 15 signs I have discussed in my previous classes. I won't discuss it again, but important sign is a Hill sign. So the difference between the upper limb and lower limb blood pressure, the lower limb blood pressure is more than the upper limb by 40 mm of Hg. It is known as a severe Hill sign. You may be able to get a Bispherians pulse. The best it is appreciated in a brachial artery, but better in a carotid artery. You may be able to get two peaks in systole, and that is what is known as a Bispherian pulse. Why do you get two peaks? Because the first ejection is caused by the LV ejection time, and the second ejection is by the transmitted pulse from the upper extremity. It is a transmitted pulsations, and because of the systemic runoff, there is a transmitted pulsations from the upper extremity, and that is why you get the second peak, that is known as the Bispherians pulse. Or you also get Bispherians in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. You should always know. Wide pulse pressure with low diastolic blood pressure is again a sign of severe aortic regurgitation, and peripheral signs of AR, head to toe examination, if they are there, it suggests that it is a severe aortic regurgitation. Apart from this, what other findings do you get which tells that there is severe AR? If you have a cardiomegaly, like a dilated hyperdynamic type of LV apex, it may sometimes tell that there is a severe AR. Length of the murmur, a hollow diastolic murmur, means that it is a severe AR. And Austin Flint murmur, if it is there, that is a flow murmur across the mitral valve, it is a severe AR. So there are many signs of severity of aortic regurgitation which you should all know. Hill sign, as I already discussed, more than 60 is definitely severe, but anything more than 40, you should take it as a significant Hill sign and tell that the aortic regurgitation is severe. Currently, we do not use Hill sign to tell. Currently, Hill sign is not the most sensitive sign because it may have other important causes, like other causes of peripheral runoff. So Durozius sign, which you know that if you compress the distal femoral pulse, you get a diastolic murmur, and that is known as a Durozius sign. That is the most sensitive sign currently for aortic regurgitation. And Hill sign is a sphygmometric artifact. If you do an invasive monitoring of the upper limb and lower limb BP, you may not be able to get this difference. And it is a sphygmomanometric artifact. You should always remember. Still, we all use Hill sign in clinical cardiology, and it will remain till the clinical cardiology is there. But Durozius sign is the most sensitive sign for aortic regurgitation. Sometimes you may not be able to get a Hill sign. So it may be falsely low in patient with LV dysfunction. Acute AR, in patient with acute AR, usually the Hill sign is not there. LV dysfunction, it is not there. And if the patient has associated aortic stenosis or mitral stenosis, you may not be able to get the Hill sign. So you should always know the causes of a false low Hill's sign. I already discussed the bispherians. You should know the other causes of bispherians, which has two peaks in systole, like the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, severe AR with mild to moderate AS may also have bispherians pulse, and severe AR itself may have a bispherians pulse. We get two types of wave, percussion wave and a tidal wave, due to the reflected waves from the periphery in aortic regurgitation. The first peak, second peak may be equal to the first or more than the first in AR. But in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the first peak is always more than the second peak. That you should always know. Carotid shudder. Now, I just want one thing to tell, that carotid shudder is not equal to carotid thrill. Carotid shudder, most of us think that we get in severe isolated aortic stenosis, but no, carotid shudder you get in combined aortic regurgitation and aortic stenosis. You never get carotid shudder in a isolated aortic stenosis. Combined AS and AR cause a vibration at the height of carotid pulse, which is known as a carotid shudder, and that you should always remember. Now, what happens to the blood pressure? It should be measured in both upper limb and one lower limb. And you should, as I already discussed, systolic blood pressure in AR is usually high normal, 140 to 150. And if it is 100 to 110, you should always think of associated aortic stenosis in a patient with AR. AR patient, if the systolic BP is 100 to 110, one, you should think of LV dysfunction. Second, you should think of aortic stenosis associated. That may cause the low systolic blood pressure, also known as systolic decapitation. Diastolic blood pressure will be very low, usually around 50. It suggests that it is a severe aortic regurgitation. Any diastolic BP which is more than 60, you should rethink that it is a severe aortic regurgitation. Pulse pressure will be very wide, as I already discussed. And what is the basis of peripheral signs of AR? One, high systolic blood pressure. Second, low diastolic blood pressure. So wide pulse pressure and low diastolic blood pressure are the basis of peripheral signs in AR. Why systolic is high? Due to high stroke volume. Why the diastolic is low? It is because of the reflex vasodilatation and fall in SVR. So this is the mechanisms of low diastolic in a patient with aortic regurgitation. The most sensitive sign remains the Durozius sign and not the Hill sign. And Hill sign can have many other causes, whereas the Durozius sign user doesn't have any other causes apart from aortic regurgitation. Now, what happens to the heart sound in AR? As I already discussed in AS, in AR also S1 is usually normal unless the patient develops LV dysfunction, which causes the premature closure of mitral valve, and so the S1 is usually soft. S2 is usually again same like AS. The A2 is delayed due to the longer ejection time, and sometimes you may be able to get a narrow split or a single second heart sound because of the delayed A2 or the paradoxical split. Paradoxical split is unlike as in patient with AS. However, if the patient has associated LV dysfunction and LBBB, where the aortic sound appears late, you may be able to appreciate a paradoxical split. A2 is invariably soft in valvular aortic regurgitation. If it is a normal and a loud, you should always think it is due to aortic root abnormality like a Marfan or a bicuspid aortic valve and all other things. Otherwise, A2 is usually soft in a patient with valvular aortic regurgitation. LVS3, if it is there, it always suggests that the patient has LV dysfunction. Otherwise, you do not get a LVS3 in patient with AR. If S4 is usually not a sign of chronic severe AR, you should always remember that. Now, as I already discussed in the previous slide, what is the difference between the valve and the root pathology? If it is due to the aortic root dilatation, one, the A2 will be loud, it will be tambour quality, and the murmur will have a musical quality in syphilitic AR. The murmur is best heard on the right sternal border, which is also known as the Harvey's sign in AR. In rheumatic AR, the murmur is best heard in the Erb's area. You get a dullness in the right second intercostal space due to a dilated ascending aorta in root dilatation etiology. And this is how you have to tell. A2 is soft in root pathology, loud in root pathology, A2 is soft in rheumatic. EDM, the site of EDM also I told you. So somebody asks you the question, should be the answer you all should tell in examination. Now, how does the acute AR is different from a chronic AR? Patients with acute AR, most of the time they present with acute pulmonary edema. They have orthopnea, PND, right side heart failure because of the pulmonary venous hypertension. They develop pulmonary artery hypertension. BP is normal or BP is even low. You do not get any peripheral signs in acute AR. You patient is tachycardia, tachypneic, JVP will be elevated. S1 will be soft because most of the time they have a LV dysfunction. You do not get a cardiomegaly. LVS3 will be invariably there present, and S2 will be soft. A2 will be soft. P2 will be loud because of the pulmonary artery hypertension. You never get a long diastolic murmur. You may get a short early diastolic murmur in patients with acute AR. So this is how you have to differentiate a patient of a acute AR from a chronic AR. So again, I would like to stop here for 1 minute before I go next. Only 10-12 slides are there for tricuspid valve disease. So any doubt is there, you can ask here. Anybody has any doubt? Otherwise, I'll proceed to the tricuspid valve diseases. Right. So the next is about the tricuspid valve disease. Most of the time, you do not get an isolated tricuspid valve disease either in bedside patient or in your examination, because most of the time the tricuspid valve disease is secondary to mitral valve disease or aortic valve disease or a mixed disease where you get a hypertensive pulmonary artery hypertensive TR, and you get all the findings. Isolated or organic tricuspid stenosis or regurgitation is very rare, and most of the times you do not get it. So the tricuspid valve disease has a long history of symptoms, and if a patient with mitral stenosis develops a tricuspid valve disease, you should think means, or if a patient with mitral stenosis has an improvement in symptoms of dyspnea, orthopnea, PND, you should always think that the patient has developed a tricuspid valve disease. This is one thing you should always remember because they may definitely ask you in exam. And increasing symptoms of right heart failure like ascites, pedal edema, anorexia, and fatigue are the symptoms of a tricuspid valve disease. And it is almost always associated with mitral valve disease. That is one thing which you should always know. So as I already told you, tricuspid regurgitation, 85% of the time it is functional. Functional means MS causing PAH or any left side heart disease causing PAH which has developed hypertensive TR. It is because of the dilatation of the annulus and increased pulmonary artery pressure. Only 15 to 30% will have an organic because of the direct involvement of tricuspid valve. So what are the other causes of tricuspid regurgitation apart from mitral valve in say hypertensive TRs? One is carcinoid syndrome, endomyocardial fibrosis, Epstein's anomaly, infective endocarditis. RVMI can cause TR. Atrial fibrillation can cause annular dilatation and TR. And sometimes when we put pacemaker lead or a ICD lead, that can also cause a TR. So these are the other causes of tricuspid regurgitation which you should always know apart from a hypertension due to a left heart disease. Symptoms, as I already discussed, they will have a fatigue and low cardiac output like ascites, pedal edema, hepatomegaly, facial puffiness. Because of the raised venous pressure, they may also have a throbbing pulsations in the neck. And once they developed this symptom, the symptoms of orthopnea, PND, and dyspnea usually goes off. What are the non-cardiac findings? Again, an important question in your exam. What are the head-to-toe findings in a patient with severe tricuspid regurgitation? You get a pulsatile proptosis or exophthalmos. Patient may be jaundiced or icterus. You may have a engorged neck veins, and you may get a ear pulsation, earlobe pulsation. The earlobe pulsation will be out. Head bobbing. There is two types of sign: yes, yes movement and no, no movement. In TR, severe TR, because you get no, no movement because of the hepatomegaly, with the flow in the liver, the head will move towards left and right. In aortic regurgitation, because the aorta is dilated anteriorly, the head movement is anteroposterior. That is called as yes, yes sign. So in TR, you get a head bobbing known as the no, no movement. Then you may get a hepatosplenomegaly. systolic pulsation in the liver. If there is a tricuspid stenosis, you get a pre-systolic pulsation. If it is a TR, you get a systolic pulsation. Splenomegaly, ascites, peripheral edema is also a sign. Cachexia due to protein losing enteropathy is also a sign of severe TR. Sometimes you may get a acrocyanosis. So somebody asks you in exam what is a head to toe examination in severe TR, you should always be able to tell all these things. In JVP, it is one of the things which is important in TR is JVP, because the first thing to happen is the obliteration of the X descent. So the loss of X descent is the first sign of a TR. Then you get a prominent CV waves, because severe TR you get a prominent V waves with Y descent, steep Y descent known as the Friedrich sign, and prominent CV waves are also known as a Lenzi sign. So prominent CV waves and Y descent is a feature of chronic severe tricuspid regurgitation. And there is an inspiratory rise in the venous pressure. Then you get a pistol out sounds over the jugular veins, and absent AV if AF is there. So two things you should always remember in TR. First is CV waves, second is prominent Y descent, and the earliest thing to occur is a obliteration of the X descent. So if you tell this, you will definitely get bonus marks. Now severe TR, you get a prominent CV waves, you get a systolic hepatic pulsation. So if somebody asks you what is the sign of severe tricuspid regurgitation, you should be able to tell my patient has a prominent CV waves on JVP and has a systolic hepatic pulsations. I am able to get a pansystolic TR murmur, which is increase on inspiration and a leg raising, and RVS3 is there. If all these features are there along with a flow mid diastolic murmur, which is very difficult to get, you can definitely tell that the patient has a severe tricuspid regurgitation. If you are not able to get inspiratory augmentation of a murmur, it means that the patient has either a RV systolic dysfunction or a RV dysfunction, or maybe atrial fibrillation is there, which cause the loss of inspiratory augmentation of the murmur. How do you differentiate a high pressure because of the left side heart disease and a low pressure TR? There are few findings. The most important is because of the signs of PH, you get all other findings of PH, like a loud P2 and other findings of PH. In a low pressure or a normal pressure TR, you do not get the signs of PH or a loud P2. You get a soft P2. The murmur is pansystolic in a hypertensive TR. It is a early systolic in a normotensive TR. You get a prominent CV waves in high pressure TR, but you do not get a prominent. You may get some CV wave, but you do not get very prominent CV waves in a normotensive TR. And the murmur is early systolic. You may not be able to get prominent hepatic findings in a normotensive TR. So these are the things you should be able to differentiate, and high pitch murmur versus a low pitch murmur. So this is how you have to differentiate a TR from a hypertensive and a normotensive. TS most of the time won't be there and may not be there in your exam also. But if TS is there, it is almost always rheumatic. That is how you should remember. Isolated TS doesn't happen. It is always associated with a mitral valve disease and sometimes with the aortic valve involvement. And if the TS is there, you should always look for tricuspid regurgitation. Clinically, only 5% will have, but if you do a autopsy, 15% will may have a tricuspid stenosis. More common in females compared to the male. How do they present? Because of the tricuspid stenosis, they present with progressive fatigue because of low cardiac output. They may have a pre-systolic hepatic pulsations. Again, they will have hepatomegaly, ascites, and anasarca. Symptoms of dyspnea, orthopnea, PND won't be there in spite of having a mitral stenosis, as I already discussed. And right side heart failure like peripheral edema and ascites is out of the proportion of the pulmonary symptom. JVP is the key. You get a giant A waves and a slow Y descent. As I already discussed, other causes of giant A waves in JVP is PAH, you get in right atrial myxoma, and you get in tricuspid stenosis. Apart from that, other things are tricuspid atresia and all, where you get a giant A waves on JVP. But the Y descent, because the tricuspid stenosis, the Y descent is usually slow or absent. You get a pre-systolic pulsation and a pulsatile lever, there will be no parasternal lift, and you may murmurs of mitral valve and aortic valve you should be able to demonstrate. You will get a mid diastolic murmur like a mitral stenosis, the mid diastolic murmur across the tricuspid valve, and the opening snap may also be present. You will be able to sometimes hear the loud T1 component in the M1 T1. The murmur usually has an inspiratory augmentation. The MDM has a inspiratory augmentation. So just briefing of what happens to JVP in valvular heart disease. If it's due to a right heart failure, tricuspid valve disease, it will be grossly elevated. If prominent CV waves are there, Y descent is there and X is absent, it means there is a hypertensive TR. Prominent A wave without elevation, not raised, but prominent A wave in JVP such as pulmonary hypertension, but it can also be there in aortic stenosis, which is known as the Burnham effect. Because of the severe LVS, the septum is pushed toward the right side, causing a decreased compliance of the RV. Prominent A wave with slow Y descent suggests severe tricuspid stenosis, and the absent A wave is present in atrial fibrillation. So this is how JVP helps in valvular heart disease. In mitral stenosis, the JVP is usually normal unless the patient develop PH. What happens to the apical impulse? In MS, it is usually normal, and what we get is a tapping apex. If the patient has severe RV enlargement and the RV dysfunction, we get a RV type of apex. Chronic MR and AR both causes a downward and outward known as a hyperdynamic apex. And if the patient has a hyperdynamic which becomes sustained and diffuse, it means that the patient has developed LV dysfunction. AS, most of the time it is heaving, but it is not displaced. If in the AS, if it is a displaced in the sixth intercostal space, you should think that the patient has either developed LV dysfunction or has associated AR and MR, which is causing the shift of the apical impulse. Now, how do you assess that the patient has pulmonary venous hypertension? We most of the time we can able to tell pulmonary artery hypertension by their signs like the paraexternal heave, loud P2, dullness in the second left intercostal space, tricuspid regurgitation murmur, and a CV waves and a hepatomegaly. So this will tell that PAH is there. How do you tell that pulmonary venous hypertension is there? If the patient has history of orthopnea and PND, it means there is a PVH. Or PND may tell that moderate PVH is there, but orthopnea means that severe PVH is there. Pulmonary edema is there on the X-ray, or bilateral basal crepitations may tell that it is a severe PVH. And what are the features of pulmonary hypertension? You have a prominent A waves in the JVP, parasternal heave is there, epigastric pulsations are there, pulmonary artery dullness in the second left intercostal space, pulmonary artery pulsations are there, loud P2 and a palpable P2 is there, and a TR murmur and a PR murmur is there. It means that the pulmonary hypertension are there. When do you tell severe PH? If there is a grade 3 parasternal heave with a loud and a widely audible P2 and a TR murmur, you can definitely tell that the severe PVA, pulmonary hypertension is there. But if the patient has chest wall deformity, emphysematous chest, and a previous surgery in the chest, and in elderly, the pulmonary hypertensive findings may be masked. So before I conclude, this is how you have to tell the final diagnosis in a patient with valve disease. Etiology, you should tell that chronic valvular heart disease, rheumatic, degenerative, mitral valve prolapse, or bicuspid aortic valve. You should tell it's a severe MS with a moderate AR. At your level, never tell in one valve too severe, like a severe MR, severe MS, or a severe AR, severe AS. In two different valves, you can tell too severe, like a severe MS, severe AS, severe MR, severe AS. That you can tell. You should tell how much PAH is there based on your finding, moderate PAH or severe PAH. Never try to quantify mild PAH by examination. PVH, you can just tell PVH is there. Mild, moderate, severe, try not to tell. Because if you have orthopnea PND, then you can definitely tell significant PVH is there. In sinus rhythm or in AF, you should always tell. Heart failure, you should always tell. What are the signs of heart failure? Bibasal crepitations, orthopnea PND, or right side ascites pedal edema tells that it is a heart failure. Then you should be able to tell the NYHA class 1, 2, 3, or 4 if any features of acute rheumatic activity is there or endocarditis is there, how much is the LV function of the feature patient, and the precipitating factor, how the patient has worsened. If you are able to tell all this, you will get good points at